Just imagine, you started your first year at a new high school. For the most part, you're a pretty well-behaved kid, but sometimes you do something stupid that lands you in detention. After a while, you start to notice something. A lot of the kids that are in detention are in there every time that you are. You ask around and you find out that these kids are in detention pretty much every day. You decide to ignore them because they're probably troublemakers and you really don't want to be in with that crowd. And then, second semester rolls around and you find out that a lot of these troublemakers are in your classes. You see that they act up a lot, which makes sense as to why they're in detention all the time. But you also start to notice other things, like how when the entire class is acting up, they'll be the only ones getting in trouble. Or if they get a poor mark, the teacher will ridicule them in front of the class. But when they do ask for help, the teacher just ignores them. You start to talk to some of these kids, and you find out that a lot of them have troubled home lives, or they get bullied at school, or they usually get ignored by teachers, which is why they act out so much. Now, take this same situation, but change three things. 1, replace high school with the country. 2, replace detention with prison. And 3, replace troubled kids with indigenous people. Once you do that, it's pretty clear to see that the way that our justice system treats indigenous people. And once you look at the statistics, it's pretty plain to see that our justice system has a problem with racism, with indigenous people making up 1/4 of our prison population, but only 4% of our total population. And that's only looking at the total incarcerated population. Indigenous youths make up 6% of youth population in Canada, but make up almost 30% of incarcerated youths, while Indigenous women make up only 4% of the female population in Canada, but make up over 40% of the incarcerated women in Canada. This means that less than 5% of the female population make up almost half of the incarcerated population, which is an insane amount of overrepresentation. This all starts in the courts. One of the worst examples is the sentence disparity between Indigenous and non-Indigenous offenders. This means that Indigenous people will often receive a longer sentence than non-Indigenous people, even when you take into account things like the severity of the crime or the criminal history of the felon. But it could even be something as simple as the judge wanting to set an example. Now, once they get to prison, Indigenous people are expected to deal with a lot of discrimination and unfair targeting, both from prison officials and their fellow prisoners. One of the biggest problems is solitary confinement. Prisoners are isolated from the rest of the prison for up to 22 hours a day for an indefinite amount of days. There are a lot of problems associated with it, like the development of mental disorders or making already existing mental disorders worse. Indigenous people, the worst part is the reasons for being put in solitary confinement are entirely up to prison officials. So if you end up getting sent to a particularly racist prison, you could be sent to solitary confinement for almost no reason at all and for who knows how long. Female Indigenous prisoners have it even worse, as them being part of 2 marginalized groups has often led to the development of some pretty bad mental disorders, which usually leads to them being classified as high-risk prisoners. However, these tests completely ignore the underlying causes that have led to these classifications in the first place. Not to ignore teen offenders, Indigenous youth are more than 8 times more likely to be incarcerated than their white counterparts, with nobody thinking about how this is probably because they've grew up experiencing discrimination throughout their entire lives, which probably contributes to the fact that most of them have at least one mental disorder. These are probably made a lot worse by the fact that they're spending time in the hostile environment of juvenile detention centers, and there's not a likely chance that they'll be getting mental help. With how far our country has come in equality, this is just something we can't ignore. When we have a problem, we don't just lock it away and forget about it. We go to the root of the problem and fix it. So if we have vast amounts of Indigenous people being overrepresented in our country's prisons, we can't just keep locking them away and hope it eventually fixes itself. We have to get to the root of the problems, like racism and mental health. If we are truly an equal country, this is something we just can't let stand.